When we're talking about racial relations or the Black experience in the United States, there's a myth we like to push about the Midwest, that it was neutral ground, it was safer, it was freer, that it's a region of small towns and open fields where people minded their business and didn't get tangled in the conflicts that define the South. But the truth is, the Midwest has never been neutral, and it was shaped by a constant tug of war over what freedom actually means and who's allowed to claim it. From a freedom lawsuit filed in St. Louis in 1846 to a massacre just across the river 70 years later, the fight for freedom in the region wasn't just an urban story. It was a regional one, built from the relationships between cities and the rural communities that fed them. Dred Scott and Harriet Scott were an enslaved couple living in St. Louis. And in 1846, they filed suit for their freedom. Their argument was simple but revolutionary because they had lived in Illinois, a free state, and the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was outlawed under the Northwest Ordinance. They should no longer be enslaved. It seemed like a strong case. The idea that once free, always free had already been upheld by Missouri courts before. But as the case wound its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, it exposed something deeper, a national fear that true freedom for Black people would unravel the entire economic order. Chief Justice Roger Taney's ruling in 1857 made that fear official. He declared that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Dred Scott decision didn't just deny citizenship, it questioned whether freedom itself could exist for Black Americans anywhere in the country. What's often overlooked is that geography beneath the decision. That so-called free soil of Illinois and Wisconsin wasn't free in practice. Rural Illinois, particularly in the southern counties, was economically tied to the slaveholding South. Farmers relied on southern trade, and rivers moved cotton, corn, and livestock down the Mississippi. The wealth of these free communities flowed from systems that still depended on enslaved labor just across the river, and you better believe they would do anything they could to make sure to keep it, even if it meant violence. So, even though Illinois had outlawed slavery, its rural economy remained connected to it and benefited from the same system it claimed to reject. Freedom, in other words, was conditional. It was defined not by justice, but by geography. For newly freed people, this was a moment of possibility. Families reunited, Black churches and schools flourished, and new political leaders emerged from communities that had once been enslaved. But while textbooks often center Reconstruction around southern cities, much of the struggle happened in rural border regions, in the fields, river towns, and back roads of Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, and even southern Illinois. In those places, the end of slavery didn't mean equality. Rural white communities, threatened by the idea that Black autonomy, passed local Black codes and vagrancy laws that made it nearly impossible for free people to own land or find stable work. Many who refused to return to plantation labor were arrested and leased back out to white landowners. Across the Midwest, especially in small towns along the Mississippi, the rural order of racial control survived Reconstruction. And while federal troops were enforcing new rights in the South, rural Illinois and Missouri quietly recreated old hierarchies under new names. And that tension between federal freedom and local control set the stage for what would come next. I also want to say that we talk about laws governing Black women's appearances particularly are usually talked about down south in Louisiana in particular. However, cities and towns in Illinois also put out laws and codes that force Black women to cover their hair or only wear certain garments to be allowed within city limits. By the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution reached the Midwest, and railroads crisscrossed the region, connecting rural farms to urban factories. Grain, coal, and meatpacking turned small cities like East St. Louis into booming centers of production. And for many Black families in rural Missouri, Arkansas, and Mississippi, this economic shift offered an escape. Sharecropping had replaced slavery, but the cycle of debt and exploitation was the same. The promise of industrial wages drew them north to Chicago, Kansas City, and especially East St. Louis. East St. Louis was strategically located because it sat on a river just across from St. Louis, and its factories relied on goods that came directly from rural areas, livestock, coal, and corn primarily. It became a magnet for both opportunity and conflict. By 1910, the city's black population had more than doubled, and this was fueled by migration from rural southern states. But white workers, many of whom were also immigrants themselves, saw black laborers as competition. Employers used that tension to their advantage, hiring black workers during labor strikes to keep production going and then firing them once white workers returned to work. This practice deepened racial resentment as white unions blamed black workers for wage suppression rather than the corporations exploiting them both. Mind you, black folks were not allowed into many unions until the 1960s. So black folks did not have any way to organize or advocate for themselves and their working conditions because white unions were locking them out. So as black families arrived seeking safety from violence in rural South, they found themselves in a new kind of danger, and one built from the same economic roots. In July of 1917, those tensions exploded when false rumors were spread that a black man had killed a white man. And white mobs stormed black neighborhoods in East St. Louis, burning homes and lynching residents. Women and children were shot in the streets and entire blocks were set on fire. Estimates of dead ranged from 100 to several hundred people. Being from the region, we usually say it was thousands of people that were killed. And thousands more were displaced and left homeless. The newspapers softened the blow by calling it a race riot, but survivors called it what it was, a massacre. And while the violence erupted in an industrial city, its origins lay in the rural racial order that had defined the region for generations. The same fears that once justified slavery on plantations now justified terror in factories. The same social hierarchy that controlled black labor in the countryside was now being enforced through mob violence in the city. And the massacre wasn't an isolated event. It was a culmination of decades of unresolved contradictions and in line with the hundreds of other massacres that were erupting across the country at this time. A free region was never truly free, and the working class divided against itself, and a system of progress was built on exploitation. But even in the shadow of that violence, there were places that told a different story, such as just up the river in Brooklyn, Illinois. One of the first black-founded towns in America that was established in 1830s by a free black settlers and formerly enslaved people. Brooklyn was built as a refuge from the racial violence from both the North and South. For decades, Brooklyn symbolized what real freedom could look like in the Midwest. Not freedom granted by law, but freedom built by hand through mutual aid and collective ownership. In a region defined by contradiction, Brooklyn proved that rural spaces could also be sites of resistance and self-determination. When we look at the Dred Scott decision and the East St. Louis massacre side by side, it's tempting to see them as separate chapters in history, one about slavery and law and the other about labor and violence. But together, they trace a long arc of how power and race have operated across the Midwest. Both stories hinge on geography. In Dred Scott, freedom depended on where you stood, whether your feet touched free soil. And in East St. Louis, safety depended on where you could live, where you could work, and how close your neighbors sat to white power and profit. The Midwest history of race wasn't written in its cities alone. It's written in its farmland, its rivers, and the migration routes that connected countrysides to factory floors. Every shipment of grain, mile of railroad, and every labor strike was part of a shared system, one that blurred the line between rural and urban, north and south, free and unfree. And when that system cracked, as it did in 1917, the violence that poured out wasn't new. It was inherited and passed down from the plantations, through the farms, and into the factories. What does freedom mean when the systems around you are designed to deny it? The myth of a safer North or a free Midwest only survives when we forget how deeply the region's prosperity was tied to racial exploitation. The Midwest didn't stand apart from America's racial conflict, it was their proving grounds. The Midwest was never neutral. It was and still is a battleground over who gets to belong. Next, we'll dig into rural policies of the 1900s and how governments have continued to use race and religion to manipulate rural communities.